Ranger stood close to the people who seemed most upset. A man who said goodbye to his wife and stood quietly weeping on the deck. A boy who was wailing because he hadn't been allowed to join his mother on the last boat. Ranger nuzzled the boy's hand and leaned against him. When he couldn't fix a problem, he could at least let a person know you were there. Once Lifeboat 2 was in the water, Patrick and the other crewmen moved on to the collapsible lifeboats. The band's music drifted up from the deck below, but it was harder and harder to stay calm. Twice Patrick lost his footing on the wet sloping deck. Was that how this would end? Would he simply slide over the edge into the frigid sea? Patrick crossed to the starboard side of the ship where Collapsible A was tied and started hacking at its lines with a knife. As long as he did his job, he could distract himself. As long as he kept working and sweating, it was almost possible to imagine this was just another day at the shipyard, and soon the whistle would send him home for supper. Home. Patrick's breath caught in his throat. He told his mother he'd have a promotion in the shipyard when he returned. He couldn't die here in the North Atlantic. Patrick blinked away the tears burning his eyes. "Hurry," he called to a group of women huddled nearby. "Get in the boat." The whole ship lurched then. There was a sound like iron ripping apart. "What's happening?" one of the women called out. "She's coming apart," a crewman shouted. The center of the ship was buckling. Water streamed down the decks. "Hold on!" Patrick grabbed a railing. Ranger spread his toes as wide as he could. He'd done some of his search and rescue training on wet days. He'd practiced walking on slippery, uneven surfaces, but nothing like this. People ran everywhere, slipping on the deck, clinging to the rails. Others huddled in tight little circles and prayed. "Watch out!" someone shouted. Across the ship, crewmen tipped Collapsible B off the roof of the officers' quarters onto the flooded boat deck. It landed upside down. Before it could be righted, a rush of water surged over the deck and swept it into the sea. Hundreds of people ran up the deck trying to stay in the center so the rushing water wouldn't sweep them off the boat too. Patrick spotted two men climbing up to the stern of the boat. He stared as they climbed over the railing, held on, and then, one by one, let go. Did they have a chance of surviving in the freezing ocean? "Quickly!" Patrick shouted as the last woman boarded Collapsible A. The Titanic plunged again. A giant wave surged over the deck. The lifeboat was afloat, but still attached to its ropes like a dog on a too-tight leash. "Cut the falls!" someone shouted. Crewmen hacked at the ropes with knives to free the boat, while more passengers rushed forward, trying to climb in. "Whoa!" A steward who'd gotten tangled in the ropes tripped and tumbled into the water. The man cutting the rope on Collapsible A hacked his way through the last fibers. Just then another wave washed over the ship and swept him into the sea. Ranger's paws slid on the deck. He tried to stay close to Patrick, but how could he possibly help? He couldn't stop the waves. He couldn't keep the ship afloat. He'd lost track of his first aid kit a long time ago, but it didn't matter. How could he go home when there was nothing he could do to save all these people? Screams rose up from the water. Patrick clung to a railing. He tried to breathe, tried to think. The rockets hadn't brought help. There was no rescue ship in sight. There were no more lifeboats, but there were wooden chairs in the water and boats that had launched half full. They'd rescue people from the water. They'd have to. Patrick took a deep, shaky breath. He'd have to jump. It was his best chance, his only chance, to see his mother again. He found an abandoned life jacket on the deck and put it on. He took off his boots and emptied his pockets. Any extra weight would drag him down. But then he felt the little pouch with the pennies from his father, and his eyes burned with tears. Ranger stepped up to Patrick and nuzzled his hand. It wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough on this awful icy night. But Patrick said, "Good dog, come on now." He grabbed Ranger's collar and pulled him close. "We've got to jump," he whispered. "You and me. We'll go together." Patrick took one of the pennies from the pouch and stared down at it in the moonlight. If there was any luck in that little coin, he needed all of it. He took the penny deep into the pocket of his trousers. He left the other one in the pouch and tied it on to Ranger's collar. "They're lucky pennies, dog. This way we both have one. And if I don't make it, then," Patrick swallowed hard, "then you'll have to remember me." Patrick clung to the railing with one hand as he climbed to the edge. With the other hand he kept a firm grip on Ranger's collar. He tried to ignore the screams and cries coming from the water below. He peered down into the blackness. Then he let go of Ranger and climbed over, holding the railing tight. "Ready then, dog?" He took a deep breath and let go. Chapter 13. Overboard. Patrick disappeared over the edge of the ship, and Ranger knew what he had to do. He bounded over the railing, used his hind legs to push off into the dark sky, and plunged into the sea. Ranger's belly smacked hard on the surface. Then the ocean swallowed him up. It was the coldest water Ranger had ever felt, like 1,000 needles pricking under his fur. Ranger swam to the surface. He paddled as hard as he could. He tried to keep his face out of the water so he could breathe. Above him, the ship was making horrible popping and cracking noises. The air smelled of dead fish and ice and terror. And people, so many people. Ranger paddled through the sea of floating baggage and passengers. Some of the men swam toward lifeboats in the distance. One woman hoisted herself onto a decorated wooden wardrobe as it floated past. Others bobbed in their life jackets, screaming and crying into the dark. Ranger hated hearing so much hurt, but even worse were the ones who didn't make any sound at all. The water felt colder and colder with every minute that passed. More passengers went quiet. Where was Patrick? Ranger barked. He was running out of time. He didn't know how long he could keep swimming. He couldn't feel his paws anymore. When a wooden chair floated past, Ranger scrambled up onto it. His hindquarters were still in the water, but it was better than nothing. Ranger lifted his nose into the darkness, hoping to catch Patrick's scent. He could smell the icy ocean air and smoke coming from the sinking ship. Passengers floated all around him. Ranger could smell their perfume and their wet wool coats and their fear. Finally, there, the Patrick smell. Ranger slipped off the floating chair and started swimming again. The smell went away, but then a wisp of wind brought it back. Ranger swam in that direction until he saw Patrick bobbing in the water. He was quiet, and his eyes were closed. Ranger paddled up to him and barked. He pawed at Patrick's life jacket and barked again. Patrick opened his eyes. He reached for Ranger. He couldn't speak. His teeth were chattering so hard they seemed like they might crumble to pieces. He needed to get out of the water. Ranger barked and swam away from Patrick toward the chair that was still floating nearby. But Patrick didn't follow him. Could he still swim? Ranger paddled back to Patrick and poked at his face with a paw. "What?" Patrick spit out a mouthful of water and blinked hard. Ranger swam away. This time he went all the way to the chair. He paddled up beside it and barked again. A wooden chair. Patrick's heart leaped. He'd been certain he was going to die in this icy sea. Now he took a trembling breath. The frozen air burned his lungs, but he had to find one last bit of strength. Patrick reached out an arm and forced himself to start kicking. His whole body was numb, but somehow he was moving forward. When he reached the chair, he flung an arm over the seat and pulled the top half over his body out of the water. That was all Patrick could do. Unless a rescue ship arrived soon, it wouldn't be enough to keep him alive. He was frozen and exhausted. He'd already given up back there before the dog found him. He decided that he would close his eyes and just go to sleep. But now his arms and legs were awake and hurting again. And the dog was here. Maybe he could hold on a little longer. Ranger wanted to climb up next to Patrick to keep him warm, but he was afraid the whole chair would tip over. Patrick was so exhausted and cold, he might not have the strength to climb up again. At least Ranger had full fur, but he felt himself slowing down too. He wouldn't be able to save Patrick by himself. He needed to find help. That's what Ranger had learned to do in the search and rescue training with Luke and Dad. He practiced finding Luke when Luke was pretending to be lost or hurt. Then Ranger would give an alert. He'd bark so Dad would come and find Luke too. But tonight, there was no one left to help. The big ship had tipped into the water. It was nearly vertical, with its stern pointing up at the night sky. The Titanic groaned and roared with explosions as its insides pulled apart. On the highest deck, ropes snapped. With a grinding roar, one of the towering funnels toppled over and slammed into the sea. It sent a giant wave heading straight for them. Ranger barked and pawed at Patrick's arm. He had to stay awake. He had to hold on. Then the wave hit. It lifted the chair deck as if it were nothing more than a splinter. When it splashed down again, Patrick was gone.